Hello, thank you for joining me today. My name is Twyla Braze. I am president and co-founder of Citizens Council for Health Freedom. And today I'm not here to talk with you about COVID-19. I'm coming to you with Real ID. Now, some of you may wonder why an organization that focuses on health freedom would be concerned about Real ID. But we look at this card as a national ID card, and it will become a no card, no care card. So in other words, a national ID card that would become a single number for which all sorts of things, including your access to health care, it will be used for. So without this card, eventually, if enough people get it, without this card, the government could say you can't access healthcare services. So let me just tell you a little bit of history and tell you why I'm bringing this to your attention today. So the history of this is that in 2005, a few years after 9/11, Congress passed this law in the dead of the night, truly in the dead of the night. U.S. Senator Lamar Alexander called it a national ID card and warned against it. But the Congress went forward on a bill that was labeled tsunami. It was about tsunamis. So it was really very hidden. Well, then what happened is that the federal government issued regulations. The states saw the threat to their state driver's licenses and their constitutional rights, their 10th Amendment states' rights, and they started passing laws, many unanimously on a bipartisan basis, against complying with the federal government's Real ID Act. And for many, many years, that's exactly where that stood. In 2007, 2008, 2009, state legislators said, yeah, no, we are not going to take the Real ID. It cannot be imposed here. The governor can't do it. The legislature can't do it. It can't happen. But then in late 2015, the Obama administration came up with a very clever idea. And so they started to announce that if you don't get the Real ID, you will not be able to fly. And they heralded this idea everywhere, and the media helped them. And so the American people became very afraid that they would not be able to fly, and they put pressure on their state legislators, and their state legislators started to cave. And so one by one, legislators decided to comply with the Real ID law. However, most states have given people a right to have a standard driver's license instead. And so I want to tell you several things about the Real ID. One, you don't need a Real ID to fly. That's the first thing you need to know. You don't need one to fly. And I have right here from the Department of Homeland Security the actual language that says you don't need it to fly. Here you go. It's right here. It says DHS, that stands for the Department of Homeland Security, notes that individuals without a Real ID compliant document will still be able to enter federal facilities and board commercial aircrafts. So you can still fly, and you know that now if you have been to an airport and you have looked at one of their signs about Real ID, where they actually tell you that if you need a Real ID or other acceptable documents. That was not talked about during the 2 years where Real ID was being imposed state by state back in like 2016 and 2017. They didn't talk about that, but they're talking about that now because so many states are having a hard time putting the machinery into place to make the Real ID happen that they are very concerned that people will end up at the airport on October 1st of this year without a Real ID, and they won't be able to fly, and it will be a disaster at airports around the country. So they're actually telling the truth now that you can have other types of documentation. So I'm going to show you some of those other types of documentation. Here's a whole list from the Department of Homeland Security. There's an entire list. Now what most people will do is they'll get a passport or a passport card or perhaps an enhanced driver's license. Now you might be wondering why should you even be concerned about the Real ID? Oh, or maybe the first question is, why am I bringing it up? I'm bringing it up because there's a brand new campaign out of the Department of Homeland Security to get you to agree to the Real ID rather than a standard driver's license and using a passport to fly. So here's their campaign. It's called Be Your Real ID Self. Be Your Real ID Self. This is the latest Homeland Security campaign to get you to take the Real ID instead of a standard driver's license. Now, I told you that states were concerned about states' rights, and so I'm just going to show you this letter from the Pennsylvania legislature to President Trump back in January 24th, 2017. Here you go. And I'll show you that bottom part. I'll read that to you. It says, opposition to the Federal Real ID Act in Pennsylvania has been based on the following concerns. And they have 4, but I'm only going to read the first one. And the first one is called States' Rights. States have been the exclusive regulator of driver licensing and have instituted their own regulations and policies regarding the issuance of licenses and safety information and other aspects of transportation policy administration. Then they go on to talk about the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment establishes that, quote, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, end quote. And then they say this one sentence. By federalizing driver licensing, the Real ID Act usurps this power which has been reserved to the states. Well, with all the pressure from DHS and with all the pressure back then when they were saying you can't fly, even Pennsylvania has agreed to the Real ID Act, but that doesn't mean that you have to agree to have a Real ID. And this is why I'm bringing you this message now, because the push is on to get everybody to get a Real ID, and I have reasons why you should decide not to. And those include, not only is it a Real ID card, not only is it a violation of states' rights and therefore your individual rights, you have to understand that it was established by and designed by the federal government, and it has to be approved by the federal government. This truly is a national ID. We've never had one in this country. And the more people that choose to get a Real ID, the more likely it is that businesses and governments around the country will start to demand the Real ID. And then we will truly have a fully implemented national ID card in this country. The more people refuse to get the Real ID card, the more difficult it will be for them to require it for things like, I wrote a list here, banks, government, clinics, hospitals, business, hotels, buying a firearm, everything you could think of will eventually require the Real ID if enough people choose it. This is why you should not choose it. You can protect states' rights, individual rights, your privacy, your freedom, keep yourself from being tracked under this one national ID number. All of that you can do by choosing a standard driver's license, a standard identification card. Choose to not purchase the Real ID, which does tend to be more expensive in addition. So the last thing that I'm going to say about that is, yes, you can fly without it, and your freedom means, protecting your freedom means saying no to a Real ID. Oh, and I did forget one other thing. Here's what the law says. The law says that the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security has unilateral power to decide additional official purposes for which the card will be required. So right now it is federal buildings, flying on commercial aircraft, and nuclear facilities. But whoever happens to be in that position of Secretary of Homeland Security could decide it needs to be used for medical care. It needs to be used to rent a car. It needs to be used to rent a hotel or to stay in a hotel. It needs to be used every time you go into the bank. That's what the law says. And when the states bow to the federal law, and if more and more people actually get a Real ID card instead of a standard driver's license, that's where we'll get to. We'll get to this being required for every transaction, and then one number, one tracking number for everyone in this country. So I encourage you to say no to the Real ID, to see what the federal government is doing here, and to make a decision that protects your freedom, your autonomy, and your privacy. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, Twyla Braze, President and co-founder of Citizens Council for Health Freedom. We have an entire page on Real ID if you just go to cchfreedom.org. And while I'm talking to you, I just want to thank everybody who donated at the end of the year for our triple match. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your support. Thank you so much.